The road stretched endlessly before them. A narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt flanked on both sides by dense, whispering woods that seemed to lean toward the car, as if they were curious or perhaps warning sentinels. The sky hung heavy and gray, the kind of sky that presses down on your shoulders even before the first drop of rain falls, and a chill clung to the air despite the late summer warmth, making the hairs on the back of anyone's neck rise as though anticipating something that couldn't yet be named. Jake, behind the wheel, tapped his fingers nervously against the steering wheel, glancing at the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if expecting to see someone or something following them. And even though his friends laughed at his caution, there was an undeniable tension in the air that had nothing to do with teenage nerves and everything to do with the forest itself, which seemed alive in a way that made the chatter of their music and the hum of the engine feel intrusive and almost disrespectful. Leela, sitting in the passenger seat, leaned back, her eyes tracing the gnarled trees that arched over the road like skeletal hands, whispering stories she didn't dare speak aloud. And she shivered, pulling her hoodie tighter around her shoulders, not just from the cold, but from the sense that something in those shadows was observing, waiting, perhaps even following, its patience endless and unknowable. "Are you sure this GPS is working?" she asked, her voice light but quivering, betraying the unease she tried to hide behind a smile. The screen glitched momentarily, a tiny stutter that made them all jump, and Jake muttered something about dead zones, though even he felt a prickle of doubt, a subtle acknowledgement that maps and signals held no sway over the forest that now swallowed the road whole. In the back seat, Carter and Mia argued playfully about who would be braver once they set up camp, their laughter echoing briefly, but feeling hollow against the oppressive silence that followed whenever the car's headlights flicked across the undergrowth and revealed shapes that weren't quite trees, not quite shadows. Carter's bravado faltered every time he caught a movement from the corner of his eye, and Mia noticed, smirking despite the nervous tremor in her fingers as she adjusted the camera mounted on her lap, trying to capture every inch of their journey for their vlog, but already sensing the forest's refusal to yield itself to lenses and pixels, as if it demanded a more personal, more tangible acknowledgement of its presence. The sun dipped lower behind the horizon, painting the sky with bruised shades of purple and deep orange that seemed to bleed into the darkness creeping across the forest floor. And when they finally reached the turnoff that led to the old, abandoned campground, the car slowed almost instinctively, as if some unseen hand had applied the brakes. The entrance was marked by a rusted sign, half-eaten by moss and ivy, the letters barely readable. Pine Hollow Camp, abandoned since '98. There was no sound but the distant caw of a crow and the wind threading through the skeletal remains of trees. Yet even that sounded too deliberate, too measured, as though it were watching their every move. "Here we are," Jake said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes, and the others tried to laugh. But it was weak, a fragile sound swallowed almost immediately by the thickening air around them. The first cabin loomed ahead, a wooden skeleton of what had once been a cheerful campsite, its walls warped and splintered, windows gaping like hollow eyes, and the smell of wet earth, decayed leaves, and something faintly metallic drifted on the wind, prickling their senses with the unnameable. Lila, gripping her backpack straps, felt her heart pound not from exertion, but from a creeping, suffocating dread that this place remembered every secret whispered under its boughs and every footstep that had dared to enter its shadow. As they stepped out of the car, the forest seemed to lean in closer, brushing against their arms with dry, brittle branches, rustling with the sound of distant voices that weren't there. And the first night stretched above them like a velvet curtain, full of eyes they could not see and promises they could not hear. None of them said it aloud, but each felt it. They were being watched, and the forest was patient. The crunch of their footsteps against the gravel path sounded louder than it should have, each step echoing into the silence as though the entire forest were listening, memorizing, and repeating it back in whispers, only just beyond their hearing. Carter, carrying the flashlight, swung its narrow beam across the decaying cabins, illuminating splintered wood, half-collapsed roofs, and broken windows covered in a film of dirt so thick it turned reflections into something warped and grotesque. The smell of mildew, rot, and long-extinguished campfires hung heavy in the air, as though the memories of summers past still clung stubbornly to the bones of this place, refusing to let go. And every so often the breeze carried with it a faint, metallic tang that felt wrong, like the sharp edge of blood. "This place is perfect," Carter said, his voice pitched higher than usual, trying to turn his own nerves into bravado, though the quiver betrayed him. And Mia raised her camera with trembling hands, nodding but keeping her lens locked on him instead of the structures, as if to reassure herself that at least one face she trusted filled her screen. Jake led them toward the main clearing, where an old fire pit sat ringed with cracked stones, blackened by decades of ash, its hollowed-out center filled with rainwater that reflected their flashlight beam like a dead eye staring up at them. Lila lingered behind, her gaze fixed on the tree line, certain that the shadows there shifted even when the wind had stilled. And when she finally pulled her eyes away and rejoined the group, she carried with her an ache in her chest that felt eerily like regret for having stepped so far into the forest at all. They explored slowly, cautiously, ducking into cabins where the air was thick and unmoving, where the walls were etched with graffiti from decades past, names, dates, crude drawings, and every once in a while, strange symbols that no one recognized, burned into the wood with something stronger than a pocket knife. Dust coated everything, rising in lazy clouds that seemed almost alive when disturbed by the thin beams of their flashlights, and the floorboards creaked beneath their weight, with a sound that seemed less like wood groaning and more like a voice, low and warning, muttering words none of them wanted to hear. It was in the third cabin that Mia discovered the journal. It lay half-buried beneath a pile of damp leaves that had blown through a shattered window. Its cover soft with mildew, the edges curled and fragile like old parchment. She picked it up gingerly, wiping the muck from its surface, revealing faded letters scratched across the front. Property of Daniel H. The way her hands trembled as she held it drew everyone closer, their breath shallow. And Jake, with a cautious glance at the room around them, urged her to open it. The pages inside were warped, the ink smudged in places, but the words still clung desperately to the paper, just scrawled in a hand that grew shakier and more frantic with each entry. The first entries were innocent enough. Notes about fishing trips, hikes, silly arguments with cabin mates. But as Mia read aloud in the weak glow of Carter's flashlight, the tone shifted. Mentions of something in the trees, of a man who doesn't walk like a man, of shadows that spoke when no one else was around, filled the yellowing pages. By the fifth entry, Daniel's writing had devolved into near illegible scratches, the words breaking apart as though his hand couldn't keep up with the fear in his mind. It waits in the dark. It copies voices. Don't follow it when it calls your name. Silence fell heavy over the group, so dense it seemed to press the air from their lungs. Jake snatched the journal gently from Mia's hands, scanning the last page that ended abruptly with a sentence unfinished. If anyone finds this, know that it isn't. The rest had bled into an inky smear across the paper, as though the pen had been ripped from Daniel's grip mid-thought. A shiver traveled through each of them, like the echo of Daniel's fear had seeped through the decades to settle in their bones, and for a long moment, none of them could find words. Then, from somewhere outside the cabin, came a sound. At first, it seemed like the wind, brushing softly against the broken window frames. But then it grew sharper, clearer. A laugh, distant and childlike, floating on the air in a way that was both playful and wrong. Too distorted to belong to anything human. Lila's breath caught in her throat, and Carter swung the flashlight toward the doorway. But the beam revealed only the empty clearing, the trees swaying faintly as if they had just moved back into place after leaning closer to listen. Probably some animal, Jake said, though his voice cracked, and everyone could hear how little he believed his own words. The journal lay heavy in his hands, its pages whispering with every tremble. And as the group huddled closer together, Mia's camera still running, the forest outside exhaled again, carrying with it that same laugh, now softer, almost intimate, as if whispering directly to them, promising that it knew their names and would not forget them. By the time darkness fully claimed the forest, the group had set up their camp in the clearing near the old fire pit. The weak glow of their lanterns casting long, trembling shadows across the broken cabins. Shadows that seemed to stretch farther and move faster than the flames themselves, as though the trees and debris were animated by a consciousness they could not comprehend. The air had thickened, heavy and wet, with a scent of decay and rain yet to fall. And every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sounded amplified, like a warning whispered by the very soil beneath their feet. Carter tried to laugh, to keep the mood light, but each attempt faltered against the pervasive unease, and every time one of them swore they heard a distant footstep, a soft brush of movement beyond the lantern's reach. The laugh fell flat, replaced by the silence that seemed alive. Mia, ever the documentarian, panned her camera slowly around the clearing, catching glimpses of shapes she could not explain. A shadow lingered just beyond the tree line, impossible to define. Taller than a man, yet fluid, shifting with the wind, as if it existed partly in another dimension. She squinted at the screen, her pulse quickening, and whispered, "Did anyone else see that?" No one answered immediately. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, a whispering that seemed to rise from the earth itself, curling around their ears in half-formed syllables that made their skin crawl. Jake held the journal tightly. flipping back to the pages where Daniel had written of voices calling from the dark, of shapes that imitated the familiar, of shadows that waited for the perfect moment to strike. He tried to convince himself it was imagination, that the forest had tricks to play on those who lingered too long. But the soft laugh that drifted again over the clearing, the same childlike, distorted sound, made him stop breathing, frozen in a moment that stretched endlessly. Maybe it's just some kids messing around, Carter said, though his voice betrayed him with a tremor, and everyone knew he was lying to themselves as much as to the others. The forest responded, or seemed to, with a sudden movement. A branch cracking sharply somewhere deeper in the trees, followed by a soft shuffle, like footsteps circling the camp. Lila's hands shook as she clutched her hoodie tighter, her gaze darting nervously to every dark space between the trunks, convinced something watched, waited, and knew exactly what she feared most. Then the voices came. Soft, hesitant at first, whispers that curled around each of them, twisting familiar tones into grotesque parodies. Carter froze, hearing his own laugh echoed back at him. Slower, distorted, hollow. "Guys, do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The others nodded, their eyes wide, their bodies tense as if the air itself had grown viscous and threatening. And then came the first call, unmistakable and terrifying. Mia's own voice, calling her name from just beyond the tree line. Soft but insistent, laced with fear she had not yet felt. She turned sharply, shining her flashlight into the darkness. But the beam revealed only swaying branches and the occasional glimmer of leaves catching moonlight. No one answered. The voice called again, now clearer, beckoning her deeper into the forest, repeating her name in a tone that was almost pleading. A shiver ran down her spine, and she felt herself drawn forward, as though the night itself had wrapped her in invisible threads, pulling her towards something she could not see. Jake grabbed her arm just as she took a step. Don't go," he shouted. But his words seemed to dissolve into the shadows, swallowed by the forest that had been silent until that moment. Carter and Lila moved closer, forming a tight circle, their lanterns trembling as though they sensed the malevolence that pressed in from all sides. The voices grew louder, more insistent, now overlapping, each one a distorted echo of the others, a chorus of calls that twisted reality and memory into something alien and wrong. And then it happened. A sudden rush of movement, unseen but palpable, and a scream tore through the clearing. Carter lunged toward the sound, but Jake grabbed him, only to see that Mia was gone, vanished in the space of a heartbeat, leaving behind the faint smell of damp leaves and something metallic that made their stomachs churn. They called her name, frantic, their voices mingling with the echoes of her own, which the forest now twisted into a mocking refrain. The shadows seemed to pulse with anticipation, drawing closer to the edge of the clearing, and the realization hit them with a cold, sharp clarity. Whatever had taken Mia was not human, and it was patient, clever, and infinitely cruel. Hours, or perhaps minutes, time had begun to warp under the weight of terror. Passed as they huddled together, too frightened to move, too aware that every heartbeat, every breath, might draw the attention of the thing lurking just beyond the reach of their lanterns. The journal lay open between them, Daniel's final words taunting them. "It waits in the dark. It copies voices. don't follow it when it calls your name. They understood now that those warnings were not merely words of paranoia, but instructions, desperate and urgent, written by someone who had glimpsed the forest's true hunger and failed to survive. Lila pressed her hands to her ears, rocking slightly, trying to shut out the impossible chorus that surrounded them. But the whispers and calls persisted, threading through their minds with a precision that was almost surgical. Every so often, the shadow of a figure would appear at the periphery of the lantern light, impossible to catch, shifting forms with each blink, mimicking friends and enemies alike. The forest had revealed its predator, and the rules were horrifyingly simple. Fear, confusion, and disobedience were its weapons, and they were already under siege. By the time dawn threatened the horizon with a weak gray light, only the smallest flicker of hope remained, fragile as a thread. One of them, Mia, was gone, and the others knew instinctively that the forest had claimed her not in haste, but in the deliberate, careful way of something that savored its prey, learning each heartbeat, each instinct, before striking again. They were not merely lost in the woods. They were trapped in a web of intelligence far older and more patient than any human mind. And as the first birds cried uncertainly in the distance, a single thought echoed in every mind with terrifying clarity. They were not alone, and they might never leave. The forest, now drenched in the gray pallor of early morning, seemed less welcoming with every passing second, its shadows lengthening and twisting in ways that defied reason, bending the terrain into unnatural angles, making familiar paths appear foreign and threatening. Jake, Carter, and Lila huddled close together near the fire pit, each holding a lantern as though the fragile glow could keep the darkness, and whatever waited within it, at bay. Yet even the flames seemed to falter, sputtering as if the air itself resisted illumination. Every rustle, every whispered shift of leaves sounded like deliberate movement, a calculated encroachment, and the realization that the forest was not merely passive, but actively observing filled them with a primal, choking dread. The silence was broken first by a whisper, soft and intimate, curling around Lila's ear with such familiarity that she jerked backward, nearly toppling her lantern. "Lila, come play with us," it breathed, low and lilting, carrying the exact timbre of Mia's voice. Lila froze, her chest tightening, her stomach turning, because she knew Mia's voice. Yet she also knew Mia was gone. The words lingered, caressing her fear, twisting it into a knot of confusion and panic. Carter tried to reassure her, reaching out, but when he opened his mouth, the whisper repeated, now layered with the faint echo of his own voice, distorted, trembling, mocking. They're calling us," he stammered, his bravado gone, replaced by something raw and frayed. Jake clutched the journal to his chest as if it were a talisman, scanning the shadows desperately. He remembered Daniel's warnings. It copies voices. Don't follow it. And yet, every instinct screamed to run, to find Mia, to answer the calls. The forest's intelligence was evident in the way the voices manipulated them, and even as they huddled together, they began to doubt one another, each wondering if the others were real or merely projections, figments conjured by the thing that lurked in the dark. The first confrontation with illusion came suddenly. From the corner of his eye, Jake saw a figure step into the clearing. Tall, thin, impossibly still. with the unmistakable posture of Mia. Her head tilted slightly as she waved at him. His heart leapt, a surge of relief and fear crashing together, until he realized that when he called her name, the figure did not respond with her usual voice, but with the same warped, childlike laughter that had haunted them the night before. Panic rose in his chest, hot and suffocating, and he stumbled back, nearly falling into the shallow pit of the fire circle. Don't trust it," he gasped, turning to Lila and Carter, whose faces were pale, drawn, and haunted. The illusion flickered and shifted in the shadows, multiplying now, taking on the forms of their missing friend, of themselves. Even of figures from the journal's pages, the lines between memory, fear, and reality blurring until none of them could say what was real anymore. Lila gripped her arms, rocking slightly, her mind straining to anchor itself. But the forest whispered to her in familiar tones, echoing her insecurities, mocking her courage, making every heartbeat feel like an exposed nerve. Carter, normally the most rational of them, began to shake, his voice rising in panic as the illusions pressed closer. It's using us. It knows what scares us most." His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, never resting, never settling, and in that moment, he became the first to break. He bolted, running blindly toward a darkened path that seemed familiar but warped with every step. The others screamed for him, but the forest swallowed both their voices and his, leaving only the echo of his terror, bouncing cruelly off the distant trees. The journal trembled in Jake's hands as if it shared the forest's pulse, and he realized with dawning horror that Daniel's words were no mere caution. They were instructions, desperate guidance from someone who had faced this intelligence and failed. "We have to stick together," he shouted, voice raw. But Lila's trembling had intensified, her mind teetering on the edge of hysteria. The shadows around them thickened, moving independently of wind or gravity, writhing, pulsing. And for a fleeting moment, the three could have sworn they saw shapes that resembled multiple versions of themselves, distorted, staring, mimicking every gesture with an eerie precision. Time became meaningless. Seconds stretched into minutes, and each movement felt like an eternity, measured not by clocks, but by the whispers that slithered into their ears, the flicker of shadows that appeared only when they weren't looking directly. The impossibility of counting the trees when their arrangement shifted imperceptibly as if alive. The forest's predator was no longer hidden. It was omnipresent, a sentient force threading through the very air. Listening, learning, shaping the night to their fear. By late afternoon, exhaustion and terror had fused into a single, nauseating awareness. They were prey in a hunt that required no chase, only observation and psychological torment. Their minds, stretched thin by constant vigilance, began to fracture. Arguments broke out over the simplest things, directions, which cabin to inspect, who had heard what. And the forest seemed to savor the fractures, letting them grow, feeding on every doubt, every glance of suspicion, every whispered accusation. And then, as the sun dipped again, barely illuminating the forest with a sickly, dying light, Jake caught movement at the tree line. A figure, impossibly thin, limbs elongated, head tilting inhumanly. It raised a hand slowly, deliberately, mimicking Lila's gesture from earlier that morning, and the three of them froze, knowing with a bone-deep certainty that it was only a matter of time before it would call one of their names next. Panic was inevitable, and the forest waited, patient as ever, knowing the terror would come, because the predator did not need to strike. It only needed to exist, to imitate, to twist their own fears against them until there was nothing left to resist. Night had fallen fully, swallowing the forest in a velvet darkness that no lantern or flashlight could pierce, leaving only the faint shimmer of moonlight through ragged clouds to trace the shapes of the skeletal trees. Jake, Lila, and the remnants of their courage huddled near the remnants of the fire pit. The journal clutched tightly in Jake's shaking hands, the pages whispering with a faint, almost sentient rustle, as if urging him to act. The forest had changed, no longer subtle or distant in its torment. It pressed upon them directly, warping the terrain, twisting branches into impossible angles. And everywhere, the shadows pulsed with movement that defied logic, coiling and writhing like dark water. Then it appeared. The first glimpse of the creature was brief, a flicker at the edge of vision, and yet it was enough. Its form was fluid and horrifyingly undefined, black as oil yet absorbing the light around it, its limbs elongated beyond human measure, bending in directions that should have been impossible. Two eyes glowed, bright and white, piercing through the dark with a hunger that seemed to look not only at their bodies, but straight into their thoughts. It stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and with each movement, the forest itself seemed to respond, the shadows stretching toward it like servants, the air vibrating with a low, resonant hum that unsettled the mind more than any scream could. Lila shrieked when she saw it, stumbling backward into Jake, her hands gripping his arm as if her fear alone could tether them both to reality. It's real," she choked, her voice raw, cracking under the weight of terror that had built for hours. "We have to get out." But there was nowhere to go. Every path they had walked that day now seemed to lead in impossible loops, twisting back upon itself, the forest refusing to release them, the shadows dancing just beyond reach to mock their panic. Carter, who had wandered into the woods earlier in a blind attempt to flee the voices, was nowhere to be seen, and every instinct screamed to go after him. Yet another voice, distorted, hollow, echoing his own words from hours before, called back, "Don't follow me. Don't follow me." The irony was not lost on them. The forest used their own fears, their own memories, their own voices as weapons. The creature stepped closer, its glowing eyes fixed on Jake and Lila, and then it moved faster than any human could, a blur of shadow, its form shifting, stretching, mimicking them, mocking them. Jake raised the lantern, the flame flickering violently as if reacting to the creature's presence. And for a moment, he saw not the monster itself, but their own reflections in the warped, shadowed air. A version of themselves twisted and staring back with wide, terror-stricken eyes. The sensation was dizzying, nauseating. And for a heartbeat, Jake felt he might collapse into madness. Lila screamed again, and the creature responded in kind, letting out a sound that was simultaneously Mia's laugh, Carter's faltering voice, and something entirely alien, a noise that seemed to crawl beneath their skin. It moved closer, its long, spindly limbs reaching, the air around it thick with the metallic tang of fear. And suddenly, Jake realized the truth. It didn't need to attack in the conventional sense. It consumed their terror, feasted on their panic, and every second they spent frozen amplified its strength. "Run!" Jake finally shouted, grabbing Lila's hand, dragging her toward a gap in the trees that might lead out. The creature mirrored their movements, a dark shadow of impossibility, cutting them off, its eyes locked on theirs. Yet it was not the only threat. The forest itself seemed to conspire, branches snapping to block escape, roots twisting to trip them, and whispers crawling into their ears, shaping illusions of voices, footsteps, and shapes that didn't exist. They stumbled blindly, adrenaline and fear guiding them, until they reached the edge of the clearing. And then it struck, not with brute force, but precision. A shadow lunged at Lila, grasping her arm with cold, impossibly long fingers, pulling her back into darkness as she screamed. Jake swung the lantern in desperation, striking the air where the shadow had been, but it was gone, absorbed into the night, leaving behind only the echo of her scream and the metallic tang in the air. Jake fell to his knees, gasping, the journal slipping from his grip, and realized with crushing despair that the forest would not allow escape. The creature was not merely a predator. It was a manifestation of fear itself, patient, clever, omnipresent. He remembered Daniel's final words, frantic and smeared across the page. "If anyone finds this, know that it isn't human. It waits. It learns. Don't look into it." He had looked, and now it knew. The final moments were a blur of running, tripping, and the relentless pursuit of shadows that could mimic, confuse, and terrify in equal measure. Jake glimpsed Carter's distorted reflection in the corner of a cabin window, only to realize it was not Carter, not truly, but the creature wearing his form to toy with him further. The forest closed in, shadows weaving a living maze, and the lantern flickered out, leaving him in complete darkness, heart hammering against his ribs, mind teetering on the edge of sanity. And then, just before the last vestige of hope could collapse entirely, he stumbled into a small hollow, a depression in the earth surrounded by trees that somehow blocked the monster's form, if only temporarily. Panting, shaking, he clutched the journal to his chest, whispering her name. Lila, Mia, Carter, each name tasting like ash in his mouth. The forest was silent, waiting, but the hum of the shadows lingered, a promise that this night, this terror, was not yet over. That the predator did not merely hunt, it lingered, it remembered, and it would not forget the scent of fear it had tasted. Dawn arrived slowly, hesitantly, a pale gray light that filtered weakly through the trees and barely touched the forest floor, as if even the sun hesitated to witness what had transpired in Pine Hollow. Jake sat slumped in the hollow, the damp earth pressing against his knees, his hands still clutching the journal as if it could protect him from memory and shadow alike. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and iron, a lingering trace of terror that had seeped into the very soil. And though the forest seemed quieter, calmer, he knew better. The calm was deliberate, waiting, patient, like a predator holding its breath before the next strike. He called out for Lila, his voice raw and cracked, slicing through the lingering mist. But only silence answered. No footsteps returned, no familiar laughter, no comforting replies. The void where she had been, where Carter and Mia had disappeared, pressed into him with a weight he could scarcely bear. and the journal trembled slightly in his hands, as if resonating with the unease that clung to him. He knew they were gone, not simply lost, but consumed by the intelligence that had haunted the forest. And the thought made bile rise in his throat, mingling with the taste of fear that still lingered on his tongue. Rising unsteadily, Jake surveyed the clearing. The cabins were still skeletal and silent, their broken windows staring blankly as though they remembered what had occurred. He noticed the shadows clinging unnaturally to the corners of the structures, shifting slightly as though alive, and the wind that passed through the hollow carried a faint, distorted echo of voices. His friends' voices, calling, laughing, crying, impossibly intertwined with the whispers that had tormented him through the night. His stomach twisted. The forest had not released them. It had only paused, allowing the predators a retreat, to watch, to wait for the moment fear would surface again. The journal slipped from his hands onto the wet earth, its pages splaying open in the breeze. He picked it up again, scanning Daniel's frantic entries, each line a testament to terror, to a mind stretched thin by the knowledge of what the forest could do. And as he read, the shadows seemed to lean closer, almost imperceptibly. An audience patient and cruel, as if the forest itself were ensuring he understood the rules he had already broken. Every instinct screamed for flight, but the paths he had come from seemed to twist impossibly, looping back into the dark heart of the woods, leaving him stranded in a place that no map or compass could resolve. A sudden movement at the edge of the clearing caught his attention. A figure, indistinct in the half-light, moved between the trees. Jake froze, breath hitching. It was too tall, too fluid, shifting unnaturally as it stepped, a shadow among shadows. And yet for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a familiar gesture, the tilt of a head, a wave. But he knew instantly that it was imitation, a cruel echo of what he had lost. The forest, he realized, had learned, remembered, and grown more patient, more clever during the long hours of night. Fear had become its ally and memory its weapon. Jake stumbled backward, heart pounding, hands gripping the journal like a shield. And for the first time, he understood the depth of what Daniel had tried to warn him about. This was not merely a creature to be avoided or defeated. It was a force, a living shadow of intelligence, hunger, and cunning that would wait, and it would remember, and it would come again. The echoes of his friends' voices mingled with the rustling of leaves and the shifting shadows. A reminder that the forest had not finished with them, nor with him. As he turned to retreat into the hollow once more, a faint sound brushed his ear, soft, childlike, and impossibly intimate. "Jake, don't be afraid." The voice was not Mia's, nor Carter's, nor Lila's, but it carried the timbre of all of them, woven together in a way that made his skin crawl. He shivered, heart hammering, and stumbled forward, knowing the forest had claimed what it would, and that he had survived only because it allowed him, not because he had outsmarted it. The shadows swirled in the periphery of his vision, and he realized that the forest would always be there, patient, waiting for the next moment, the next name to call, the next heartbeat to taste. Jake finally broke into a run, moving blindly toward the unknown edges of the forest, carrying only the journal and the memory of screams that would haunt him forever. The hollow faded behind him, the shadows bending back into place, the trees resettling as if nothing had happened. Yet he knew the truth. A truth that would follow him long after the forest had vanished from sight. Fear had a shape here, and it was patient, intelligent, and hungry. And Pine Hollow would never let go of those who entered its dark embrace. The forest watched, and it waited.